The rattling of the cattle car shattered the morning silence as Hank Zimmerman stared blankly at the dusty horizon, his weathered hands gripping the reins with a familiar but hollow determination. It was the summer of 1878, and the relentless Montana sun beat down on his shoulders like judgment from a god he no longer believed in. 3 years had passed since he'd lost everything: his wife, his son, his ranch, and finally, his faith. All that remained was the trail, an endless stretch of dirt leading nowhere in particular. He called out, his voice carrying no conviction, as the herd of cattle plodded forward, kicking up clouds of amber dust that seemed to linger in the still air. The Blackfoot Valley spread before him, beautiful and indifferent to his suffering, much like the Almighty himself. "Mr. Zimmerman!" A young ranch hand galloped toward him, face flushed with excitement. "Got word from town. Mr. Jenkins wants the herd there by sundown, offering an extra $50 if we make it." Hank merely nodded, not bothering to share that the money meant nothing to him anymore. What use was currency to a man who'd lost his reason to live? Still, the cattle needed moving, and the men working for him needed their wages. If nothing else, Hank Zimmerman was a man who honored his obligations, even when they felt as empty as his prayers. By midday, the heat had become almost unbearable. The cattle were restless, and dark clouds gathered on the distant horizon, promising a storm that might never come, like so many promises Hank had been made throughout his life. "We should push them harder," said Tom, the foreman who'd stuck with Hank through everything. "Storm's coming, and we don't want to be caught in the open." "They'll move when they're ready," Hank replied, his voice flat. "No sense rushing death. It finds us all eventually." Tom's worried glance wasn't lost on Hank, but he pretended not to notice. His reputation as the steadiest cattleman in the territory had begun to fray at the edges. The men whispered when they thought he couldn't hear, speaking of how Zimmerman had lost his edge, his spirit, his faith. They weren't wrong. As the afternoon wore on, the first fat raindrops began to fall, splattering against Hank's worn leather hat. The cattle grew increasingly agitated, sensing the electrical charge in the air. In the distance, lightning forked across the sky, momentarily illuminating the world in harsh white light. "Boss!" Tom shouted over the growing rumble of thunder. "We need to get off this ridge." But before Hank could respond, a deafening crack split the air, and the cattle spooked. The entire herd began to stampede, careening toward the edge of the valley. Hank spurred his horse forward, instinct taking over where passion had long since died. He rode hard, the rain pelting his face as he tried to turn the lead steer, to redirect the stampede before they all plunged to their deaths. In the chaos, he didn't see the lightning-struck tree until it was too late. A massive branch came crashing down, catching him squarely across the chest and throwing him from his horse. The world spun in a blur of mud and rain before darkness claimed him entirely. When Hank opened his eyes, he was certain he'd died. A soft, golden light enveloped him. And for a moment, he wondered if, despite his loss of faith, heaven had claimed him after all. Then the pain hit searing, brutal pain across his ribs and back that confirmed he was very much alive. "Don't try to move, Mr. Zimmerman," came a gentle voice. "You've got 3 broken ribs, and that gash on your head needed stitching." Blinking through the haze, Hank found himself looking up at a woman he didn't recognize. Her auburn hair was pulled back from her face, revealing intelligent green eyes that studied him with professional concern. "Where," he began, his throat raw. "You're in my home," she replied, adjusting the blanket covering him. "I'm Grace Calloway. Your men brought you to me when they couldn't make it to town in that storm. I'm the closest thing to a doctor this side of Helena." Hank tried to sit up, but immediately regretted it. "The cattle lost about a dozen head in the stampede," she said matter-of-factly. "The rest are corralled on my property until you're well enough to move them. Your foreman, Tom, I believe has things under control." Hank sank back into the pillow, defeat washing over him again. A dozen cattle meant money lost, which meant men going unpaid. Another failure to add to his growing collection. "How long have I been here?" he asked. 2 days, Grace answered, reaching for a cup on the bedside table. "Drink this. It'll help with the pain." Hank eyed the cup suspiciously. A small smile tugged at her lips. "It's willow bark tea, not poison, Mr. Zimmerman." He accepted the cup, noting the steadiness of her hands as she helped him drink. The liquid was bitter, but he swallowed it without complaint. "You should rest," she said, taking the empty cup. "The storm's passed, but there's another brewing. Your men are welcome to stay in the barn until you're fit to travel." As she turned to leave, Hank found himself asking, "Why help us, Miss Calloway? You don't know me." Grace paused at the doorway, the lamplight catching the copper highlights in her hair. "Because you needed it, Mr. Zimmerman. No other reason necessary." In the days that followed, Hank learned more about Grace Calloway than he'd intended to. She wasn't a trained doctor, but had learned medicine from her father, who'd been the physician for a mining camp before dying of tuberculosis 3 years prior. She'd inherited his books, his instruments, and apparently his determination to heal the wounded, whether they wanted healing or not. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she admonished on the 4th day, when she found Hank attempting to stand. "Those ribs won't heal if you keep testing them." "I've got cattle to move," he replied gruffly, "and men depending on me." Grace crossed her arms, unimpressed by his stubbornness. "Your men are doing fine without you, Mr. Zimmerman. Tom visits daily to give reports. The cattle are grazing contentedly, and the ranch owner has been informed of the delay." Hank sank back onto the bed, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I don't like being beholden to anyone." "Funny thing about that," Grace said, checking his bandages with clinical efficiency. "None of us get through this life without help sometimes." "Some more than others," he muttered. She paused, her green eyes finding his with unexpected intensity. "You've helped others before, haven't you? Now it's your turn to accept help. There's no shame in that." Hank looked away first, uncomfortable with her perception. "You don't know anything about me." "I know more than you think," she countered softly. "When men are feverish, they often speak of things they might otherwise keep hidden." A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with his injuries. "What did I say?" Grace's expression softened. "You called for Sarah, and for a boy named Michael." The names hung in the air between them, ghosts that Hank had tried and failed to outrun for 3 years. "My wife and son," he said finally, the words like broken glass in his throat. "Cholera took them both in 75, 3 days apart." Grace nodded, her touch gentler now as she adjusted his pillow. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Zimmerman." "Hank," he corrected, surprising himself. "If I'm going to be stuck in your home, might as well use my name." "Hank, then," she agreed with a small smile, "and I'm Grace, not Miss Calloway." That evening, Tom brought news that the cattle buyer was growing impatient. "Says he might have to find another supplier if we can't deliver within the week," the foreman reported, hat in hand as he stood in Grace's small kitchen. "Then deliver them," Hank said firmly from his seat at the table, where Grace had allowed him to take dinner. "I'll catch up when I can." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "The men, they're not sure. Begging your pardon, boss, but they're wondering if you're coming back at all." The implication stung more than Hank expected. Had he fallen so far that his own men thought he might abandon them? "I'll be there," he said, with more conviction than he'd felt in years. "You take the herd to Jenkins tomorrow. I'll follow when the doctor here says I can ride." After Tom left, Grace busied herself clearing the dishes. "Your ribs need at least another week before you can safely ride," she said without looking at him. "And that's assuming no complications." "I'll leave in 3 days," Hank replied. "I've ridden with worse." Grace set down a plate with more force than necessary. "Is dying what you want, Mr. Zimmerman? Because that's what could happen if you re-injure those ribs and puncture a lung." Her concern caught him off guard. "Why do you care what happens to me?" She turned to face him fully, her expression fierce. "Because I've watched too many good men throw their lives away after loss. My father included. He didn't die of tuberculosis. He drank himself to death after my mother passed. Called it tuberculosis because it sounded more dignified." The revelation hung between them, raw and honest. Hank found himself wanting to reach out to her, but knew his comfort would be hollow, coming from a man as broken as himself. "I'm not trying to die," he said finally. "I just need to fulfill my obligations." "And after that?" she pressed. "What then?" Hank had no answer. For 3 years, he'd moved from one job to the next, one town to another, with no purpose beyond survival. The future was as empty as his prayers had become. That night, unable to sleep, Hank hobbled to the window of his small room. The moon hung low and full over Grace's property, 20 acres of decent grazing land, with a small cabin, a barn, and a fenced garden that was surprisingly well tended for a woman living alone. In the distance, he could see the silhouettes of his cattle, dark shapes against the silver-bathed landscape. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. "You should be resting," Grace said as she entered, carrying a steaming cup. "Can't sleep?" Hank shook his head. "Pain's worse at night." She handed him the cup. "This will help, though it might make you drowsy." He accepted it, noticing for the first time how the moonlight softened her features, making her look younger than he'd initially thought. She couldn't be more than 30, though life had clearly dealt her hardships beyond her years. "Thank you," he said, the words encompassing more than just the medicine. "For everything." Grace smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "You're welcome, Hank." Before she could leave, he found himself asking, "How do you do it? Live out here alone after everything you've lost?" She considered the question, leaning against the doorframe. "I chose not to let grief define me. It's part of me, yes, but not all of me." A pause. "Plus, I'm not entirely alone. I have patients, neighbors who check in. The Blackfoot tribe from up north, they bring me herbs I can't grow, and patients I might not otherwise see." "But it's not the same as family," Hank observed. "No," she agreed softly. "It's not. But it's something, and something is better than nothing, which is what grief offers when you let it consume you." Her words struck a chord in Hank's chest that had nothing to do with his broken ribs. For 3 years, he'd chosen nothing. No connections, no purpose, no faith. Just endless miles of trail dust and the hollow echo of memories. By morning, Hank's fever had returned, delaying any plans of departure. Grace moved efficiently around him, applying cold compresses and administering medicine with unwavering focus. "This is your body telling you it's not ready," she said firmly when he protested. "Listen to it, for heaven's sake." In his weakened state, Hank found himself more vulnerable to both physical pain and emotional memories. He dreamed of Sarah and Michael, of the little ranch they'd built together in Wyoming, of the future they'd planned that would never come to pass. He woke with tears on his face more than once, only to find Grace sitting quietly beside him, not judging, just present. On one such night, when the fever had broken but sleep remained elusive, Hank found himself talking about his family, about how he'd met Sarah at a town dance in '68, how Michael had been born a year later, strong and healthy despite arriving a month early. He spoke of building their home with his own hands, of teaching Michael to ride, of Sarah's laugh that could chase away any storm cloud. "She sounds wonderful," Grace said, her voice soft in the dimly lit room. "She was," Hank agreed, the ache in his chest both familiar and somehow different than before. "What about you? You've never married?" Grace's smile turned wistful. "Once, almost. A cavalry lieutenant passing through with his regiment. We exchanged letters for a year, made plans." She shrugged. "Then the letters stopped coming. Found out later he'd been killed in a skirmish with raiders near the border." "I'm sorry," Hank said, meaning it. "It was a long time ago," she replied. 6 years this winter." A comfortable silence fell between them, the kind that only happens when two people recognize in each other a similar pain, a shared understanding. "My faith died with them, you know," Hank said suddenly. "Sarah and Michael, I'd been a believing man my whole life, but when cholera took them both, what kind of God does that to innocent people? To a child?" Grace didn't immediately offer platitudes or scripture as others had done. Instead, she simply nodded. "I questioned everything after my mother died, even more after father followed. It's natural, I think." "But you still believe?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I do," she said after a thoughtful pause. "Not in the same way as before, perhaps. But I believe there's purpose, even when I can't see it. And I believe in goodness, even in a world that often seems cruel." Hank wished he could share her certainty. "I've tried to believe again, to pray, but the words feel empty." "Faith isn't just words," Grace observed. "It's how we live, how we treat others, how we face each day, especially the difficult ones." By the end of the week, Hank was able to move around the cabin without assistance, though riding was still out of the question. Tom returned with news that Jenkins had accepted the cattle and paid in full, minus a small penalty for the delay. The foreman seemed relieved to find his boss recovering, if surprised to see him in relatively good spirits. "The men are settling accounts in town," Tom reported. "I told them you'd meet us there when you're able." "Good work," Hank said, clapping him on the shoulder with genuine appreciation. "Take a few days for yourself before we discuss the next contract." After Tom left, Grace gave Hank a curious look. "Next contract? I thought this job was finished." "It is," Hank confirmed. "But there's always another herd needing movement. Cattle business doesn't stop." "And that's what you want?" she asked. "To keep moving from job to job?" The question made him uncomfortable, mostly because he'd been asking himself the same thing with increasing frequency as his strength returned. Being in one place for more than a few days had forced him to confront the emptiness of his existence since losing Sarah and Michael. "It's what I know," he answered finally. Grace accepted this with a nod, though he could tell she had more to say. She'd become easier to read over their time together, her expressions revealing thoughts she sometimes left unspoken. That evening, as they sat on her small porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in the shades of orange and pink, Hank found himself studying her profile. In the golden light, with her hair loose around her shoulders, Grace Calloway was undeniably beautiful, not in the flashy way of saloon girls or the proper way of town ladies, but in a manner entirely her own. Strong, capable hands that could set bones and stitch wounds, eyes that saw too much and judged too little. A quiet dignity in how she carried the weight of her losses. "You're staring," she said without looking at him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Hank didn't deny it. "Just wondering how someone like you ends up alone in a cabin, doctoring strangers and strays." "Someone like me?" she echoed, turning to face him fully. "Someone kind," he clarified, "skilled, beautiful." The last word slipped out before he could stop it, hanging in the air between them. Grace's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look away. "Life takes us on unexpected paths," she said finally. "As you well know." Hank nodded, acutely aware of how close they were sitting, how the fading light caught the gold flecks in her green eyes, how for the first time in 3 years he was thinking about a future that extended beyond the next sunrise. The moment was broken by the distant sound of approaching horses, 3 riders coming fast down the road toward Grace's property. She stood, shading her eyes against the setting sun. "Trouble," she said, her voice shifting to the professional tone he'd come to recognize. "Get inside and fetch my medical bag." By the time Hank returned with her supplies, Grace was already meeting the riders in the yard. A man was slumped over his saddle, blood soaking through his shirt, while the other 2 supported him from either side. "Ambush," one of the men was saying as Hank approached. 5 miles east. Bastards came out of nowhere, took the payroll." Grace was already directing them to bring the wounded man inside. "Lay him on the table," she instructed, rolling up her sleeves. "Hank, I need hot water and clean linens." For the next hour, Hank watched as Grace worked to extract a bullet from the man's shoulder, her movements precise and focused despite the gravity of the situation. The wounded man's companions paced nervously, explaining they were guards for the mining company's payroll wagon, the same company Grace's father had worked for years before. "Raiders have been hitting payroll deliveries all summer," one guard said grimly. "This is the 3rd time. Sheriff thinks it's an inside job, someone tipping them off about the route." The wounded man would live, Grace assured them, but needed rest before he could be moved. The other guards reluctantly agreed to leave him in her care while they returned to town to report the attack. "They'll be back," Hank said after the men had departed, watching as Grace cleaned blood from her hands. "The raiders. If they learn one of the guards survived..." Grace met his gaze steadily. "I know, but I couldn't turn away a wounded man." "I'm not suggesting you should have," Hank clarified, "just that we should be prepared." The "we" didn't escape either of them. Something had shifted between them, a tentative alliance forming in the face of potential danger. That night, with the wounded guard sleeping fitfully in the spare room, Hank insisted on taking watch. His ribs still ached, but he could handle a rifle if necessary. Grace argued briefly before conceding, bringing him a quilt as he settled in a chair near the front window. "Wake me in 4 hours," she instructed. "You need rest too." Hank nodded, though he had no intention of disturbing her sleep. The night stretched long and quiet. broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the distant howl of coyotes. He found himself reflecting on how quickly priorities could change a week ago. He'd been desperate to leave this place and return to the meaningless circuit of cattle drives and temporary employment. Now, the thought of riding away left him hollow in a different way than before. The wounded guard woke shortly before dawn, feverish and disoriented. Grace administered laudanum for the pain and cool compresses for the fever, all while murmuring reassurances in the same gentle tone she'd used with Hank. "You should have woken me," she scolded when she found Hank still at his post, the rising sun casting long shadows across the porch. "You needed the rest," he replied simply, "and I needed the time to think." Grace studied him for a moment. "And what conclusions did you reach during your vigil?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Hank moved to the door, rifle ready, but relaxed when he recognized Tom and two of his ranch hands, along with the town sheriff. "Raiders hit the mining company payroll," the sheriff explained after dismounting. "Killed one guard, wounded another. Trail leads this way." "The wounded man is here," Grace confirmed, "but stable. He needs at least another day before he can travel." The sheriff nodded grimly. "May need to leave a deputy. Those raiders might come looking to finish the job if they realize he survived." "I'll stay," Hank offered, surprising himself almost as much as Tom, whose eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "Boss, your ribs are healing fine," Hank interrupted. "And I've still got business with Miss Calloway." The sheriff looked between them, clearly drawing his own conclusions. "That would be helpful, Zimmerman. Your reputation precedes you." After making arrangements for the guard's protection and taking statements about the ambush, the sheriff departed with a promise to return the following day. Tom lingered, clearly wanting to speak with Hank privately. "The men are wondering what's next," the foreman said when they stepped away from the others. Jenkins mentioned another herd needing movement to Fort Benton. Hank's gaze drifted to where Grace was checking the guard's bandages. "Tell the men I'll meet them in town in 3 days. We'll discuss it then." Tom followed his line of sight and smiled knowingly. "Understood, boss. Seems you might have found something worth staying put for. At least for a while." After the men departed, Grace busied herself with household tasks, while Hank cleaned and checked his rifle, both of them moving around each other in a comfortable rhythm that felt disconcertingly domestic. "Your foreman seems to think you're staying because of me," Grace observed casually as she kneaded dough for bread. Hank set the rifle aside. "Tom talks too much." "Is he wrong?" The directness of her question shouldn't have surprised him. Grace Calloway had never been one to dance around a subject. Still, Hank found himself momentarily at a loss for words. "No," he said finally, meeting her gaze across the kitchen. "He's not wrong." A faint blush colored her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "I'm not looking for empty declarations, Hank. I've had enough disappointment in my life." "Nothing empty about it," he assured her, crossing the room to stand before her, flour-dusted hands and all. "I've been running for 3 years, Grace, from memories, from connection, from feeling anything at all. But being here, with you, I've started to remember there might be more to life than just surviving it." Grace's expression softened. "And what happens when your ribs heal completely? When there's no wounded guard to protect or storm to wait out?" It was a fair question. Hank had built his existence around transience since losing his family. The thought of staying in one place, of building something new, was terrifying in its vulnerability. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, "but I'd like to find out, if you're willing." Before she could respond, a crash from the spare room had them both rushing to check on the guard. They found him struggling to stand, face flushed with fever. "They're coming," he gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Heard them talking before they shot me. They've got someone in town. Someone who knows?" "Easy," Grace soothed, helping him back to bed. "You're safe here." But Hank wasn't so certain. If the raiders had inside information about the payroll deliveries, they might very well know a witness had survived, and a remote cabin with a woman healer would make an easy target. As night fell, Hank reinforced the cabin's defenses as best he could. He positioned furniture to create barriers, checked and rechecked his ammunition, and made sure Grace's shotgun was loaded and within easy reach. "This isn't your fight," Grace said as she joined him at the window, her face illuminated by moonlight. You could ride to town, bring back the sheriff. Hank shook his head. And leave you alone? Not a chance. She smiled slightly. I've been alone for years, Hank Zimmerman. I can handle myself. I don't doubt it, he replied. But you don't have to. Not anymore. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the immediate danger. Grace's expression softened, and she reached out to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his stubbled jaw. You're a good man, she said quietly, despite what you might believe about yourself. Before he could respond, a flicker of movement outside caught his attention. Shadows moving between the trees at the edge of the property, at least 3 figures approaching stealthily. Get down, Hank whispered urgently, pulling Grace away from the window just as a shot shattered the glass. What followed was chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as the raiders circled the cabin, bullets splintering wood and embedding in walls. Hank returned fire when he could, careful to conserve ammunition, while keeping Grace and the wounded guard protected. They're trying to flush us out, Hank realized as one raider darted toward the barn. Or, his suspicion was confirmed moments later when smoke began to rise from the barn's roof. They had set it ablaze, hoping the fire would spread to the cabin or force its occupants to flee. We can't stay here, Grace said, her voice remarkably steady despite the danger. There's a root cellar under the kitchen floor. A tunnel leads to the creek bed my father's precautioned during Indian raids years ago. Hank nodded, forming a plan. Get the guard ready to move. I'll hold them off as long as I can, then follow you. No, Grace said firmly, gripping his arm. We go together or not at all. The determination in her eyes left no room for argument. Together, they helped the semi-conscious guard to the kitchen, where Grace revealed a trap door hidden beneath a rug. The narrow stairs descended into darkness, illuminated only by the lantern Grace hastily lit. Go, Hank urged, firing another shot through the broken window to keep the raiders at bay. I'm right behind you. Grace hesitated just a moment before helping the guard down the stairs. Hank fired twice more before backing toward the trapdoor. Watching as flames from the barn began to lick at the side of the cabin. The heat was intense, smoke already filling the kitchen as he finally descended into the cellar, pulling the trapdoor shut behind him. The tunnel was low and narrow, forcing them to crouch as they moved. The wounded guard struggled, leaning heavily on Grace as Hank took the rear, listening for sounds of pursuit. Almost there, Grace encouraged as they reached a sharp bend in the tunnel. The exit is just ahead. They emerged into the cool night air beside a nearly dry creek bed, sheltered from view by a stand of cottonwoods. In the distance, Grace's cabin was fully engulfed in flames, illuminating the night sky with an eerie orange glow. Everything I own, Grace whispered, watching as her home and livelihood burned. Hank put an arm around her shoulders. Things can be replaced, he said softly. You can't. They didn't have time to linger. Using the creek bed for cover, they made their way east, away from the burning cabin and toward the main road. The wounded guard was struggling, his breathing labored, but he pressed on with determined steps. Town's 5 miles, Grace said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. If we can reach the Johnson homestead, they can get word to the sheriff. But before they'd covered half a mile, the sound of horses approached from behind. The raiders had discovered their escape and were in pursuit. Go, Hank told Grace, pressing his revolver into her hand. Get the guard to safety. I'll lead them away. No, Grace protested. I won't leave you. Trust me, Hank insisted, meeting her gaze in the moonlight. I'll find you. I promise. Before she could argue further, he squeezed her hand and darted away, moving perpendicular to their path and making enough noise to draw attention. As he'd hoped, the riders changed course, following him instead of continuing along the creek bed. What followed was a desperate game of cat and mouse through the darkened landscape. Hank used every trick he'd learned in 3 years of drifting, hiding his tracks, doubling back, creating the false trails. His ribs screamed in protest with every labored breath, but the pain only fueled his determination. For the first time in years, he had someone worth fighting for. When dawn broke, Hank found himself miles from where he'd started, having successfully led the raiders on a wild chase that eventually saw them give up and return toward town. Exhausted and in pain, he made his way to the Johnson homestead, where he found Grace the guard and a very concerned Sheriff Ellis. "Zimmerman!" the sheriff exclaimed when Hank staggered onto the porch. "Thought we'd lost you!" Grace rushed forward, her face pale with worry, as she checked him for injuries. "You're bleeding," she said, touching his side, where blood had seeped through his shirt. "Ribs," Hank explained between labored breaths. "Probably tore something. Worth it, though?" The guard had regained enough strength to provide details about the raiders, including the name of their contact in town. A clerk at the mining company who had access to the payroll schedule. The sheriff immediately dispatched deputies to make arrests, promising justice would be swift. "Miss Calloway's cabin is gone," the sheriff said grimly. "Burned to the ground. Nothing left but ashes." Grace's composure finally cracked at these words, tears filling her eyes as the full weight of her loss hit home. "Everything my father built, all his medical books, all my supplies." "I'm sorry," Hank said, taking her hand in his. "So damn sorry." She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the connection. "At least we're alive. That's what matters." The Johnsons insisted Grace and Hank stay with them while recovering. The wounded guard was transported to town, once stable enough to travel, and within days news came that the raiders had been captured and the stolen payroll recovered. "The mining company's offering a reward," Mrs. Johnson reported as she changed at Hank's bandages. "And compensation for your cabin, Grace. They feel responsible since it was their payroll that brought trouble to your door." Grace nodded, though the money seemed cold comfort for all she'd lost. She'd been quieter since the attack, withdrawn in a way that worried Hank. When they were alone that evening, sitting on the Johnsons' porch swing, he finally voiced his concern. "Talk to me," he urged gently. "Tell me what you're thinking." Grace stared out at the darkening horizon. "I'm thinking about starting over. Again." She sighed. "I'm tired of rebuilding from ashes, Hank. First my parents, then David, now my home." "You don't have to do it alone this time," he said, taking her hand in his. She looked at him then, really looked at him, her green eyes searching his face. "What exactly are you offering? Hank Zimmerman?" It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself repeatedly over the past days. What did he have to offer this remarkable woman, who'd saved him in more ways than one? "A partnership," he said finally. "If you'll have me, I've got some money saved. Not a fortune, but enough to build something new, something ours." Grace's expression remained guarded. "And what about your drifting, your cattle drives?" "I think I've run far enough," Hank admitted. 3 years of running hasn't brought Sarah and Michael back, hasn't restored my faith. But you—" He paused, gathering courage. "You make me want to stop running, to build again, to believe again." Something in Grace's expression shifted, hope cautiously blooming. "I can't replace what you've lost, Hank." "I'm not asking you to," he assured her. "Just as you're not asking me to replace your David. We carry our pasts with us, but maybe we can build a future together." They sat in silence as twilight deepened around them, the weight of possibilities heavy between them. Finally, Grace spoke. "I'll need supplies if I'm to continue my practice. Books, instruments. We'll get them," Hank promised. "And I want to rebuild on my property. It's good land, and the Blackfoot trusts me there." "Whatever you want." She turned to face him fully, her decision made. "I want you, Hank Zimmerman. Broken ribs, broken faith, and all." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative with the newness of their connection, then deepening with the promise of what could be. When they finally parted, Hank rested his forehead against hers. A peace he hadn't felt in 3 years settling over him. "I don't know if I can believe in God again," he confessed softly. "Not the way I once did." Grace's smile was tender as she reached up to touch his face. "Faith isn't something you have to find all at once," she said. "Sometimes it comes back slowly, like healing." Later that night, as a storm rolled in from the mountains, Hank found himself unable to sleep. The darkness reminded him too much of that terrible night, of flames and gunfire, and the fear of losing someone precious yet again. He made his way downstairs to find Grace already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a single candle burning before her. The small flame illuminated her face in a soft golden glow as she looked up at his approach. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. Hank shook his head, taking a seat across from her. "Too many ghosts tonight. Grace nodded in understanding. The storm always brings them closer somehow. Outside, thunder rumbled, and rain began to patter against the windows. The candle flickered between them, casting dancing shadows across the table. "When I was a little girl," Grace said, her voice soft in the dim room, "my mother told me that candles were special, that they didn't just push back darkness, they carried prayers upward." Hank watched the small flame, remembering prayer candles in the church where he'd once worshipped, where he'd christened his son and later buried both him and Sarah. "I haven't prayed in 3 years," he admitted. "Wouldn't know how to start again." Grace reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. With her other hand, she gently pushed the candle closer to him, its warm light reflecting in her eyes. "The cowboy's faith was gone," she said softly, echoing his thoughts with uncanny precision. She lit a candle and said, "Now you can borrow mine." Something broke open in Hank's chest, not painfully, but like ice cracking in spring, allowing water to flow once more. He tightened his grip on Grace's hand, anchoring himself in her strength as tears filled his eyes for the first time since burying his family. "Thank you," he whispered, the words inadequate for what he felt. They stayed that way through the storm, hands joined across the table, the candle burning between them, a small but steady flame against the darkness, illuminating a path forward neither had expected to find. 6 months later, a new cabin stood on Grace's property, larger and sturdier than the one before. Beside it, a small clinic had been built where Grace continued her father's work, treating anyone who came seeking help. The mining company had made good on their promise of compensation, and with Hank's savings added, they'd created something neither could have managed alone. On a crisp autumn evening, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching as the setting sun painted the Montana sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. Grace leaned against Hank's side, his arm comfortably around her shoulders as they savored the peaceful moment. "Sheriff Ellis stopped by the clinic today," Grace mentioned. "Says the last of the raiders was sentenced yesterday. 20 years. Hank nodded, satisfaction in his expression. "Good. Justice served." "He also mentioned Jenkins is looking for someone to move cattle to Wyoming next month," she added, studying his reaction. "Said you were the best in the territory." Hank considered this, remembering the restlessness that had driven him for so long, the itch to move, to avoid putting down roots that might be torn away again. But that urge had faded, replaced by something stronger, the desire to build, to grow, to remain. "Jenkins will have to find someone else," he said finally. "I've got more important things to tend to here." Grace smiled up at him. "You don't miss it? The open trail?" "Some days," he admitted honestly, "but not enough to leave what we've built." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Not enough to leave you?" The wedding had been small but joyful, held in the town church with Tom serving as best man and Mrs. Johnson standing up for Grace. The Blackfoot medicine woman who often consulted with Grace had blessed their union in her own tradition as well, ensuring protection from both their God and hers. "Speaking of building," Grace said, a hint of mystery in her voice, "I need to show you something." She led him inside to their bedroom, where she opened the drawer of her nightstand and removed a small object wrapped in cloth. "What's this?" Hank asked as she placed it in his hands. "Open it and see." Carefully he unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small pair of knitted booties, impossibly tiny and perfect. Hank stared at them uncomprehendingly for a moment before understanding dawned. His eyes flew to Grace's face, finding confirmation in her radiant smile. "You're—" He couldn't finish the sentence, emotion overwhelming him. Grace nodded, placing her hand over his. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday. We're having a baby, Hank." Joy and terror warred within him. Joy at this new life they'd created together, terror at the thought of loving so completely again, at risking such devastating loss. Grace, knowing him better than anyone, recognized his fear. "I know what you're thinking," she said gently. "I'm scared too. Life offers no guarantees." "If anything happened to you, to either of you," Hank began, unable to complete the thought. "Then we would face it together," Grace finished for him. "That's what faith is, Hank. Not certainty that nothing bad will happen, but courage to embrace life anyway. To love anyway." She took the candle from their bedside and lit it, its small flame creating a circle of light in the gathering dusk. "Every night since we met," she said softly, "I've lit a candle for your faith until you found your own again, for our future together." Hank pulled her close, one hand resting gently on her still flat stomach where their child grew. "I think I understand now," he said, watching the candle flame dance. "Faith isn't what I thought it was. It's not about believing everything happens for a reason. It's about finding reasons to go on when life gives you none." Grace reached up to touch his face, love shining in her eyes. "And have you found yours?" Hank smiled, a full, genuine expression that reached his eyes that had once been as empty as his prayers, but now reflected the light of the candle, the light of hope restored. "I have," he answered simply. "I've found them in you." Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, pinpricks of light in the vast Montana night. Inside, in the warm glow of their home, Hank and Grace Zimmerman stood embraced, the small candle flame between them, a testament to faith lost and found again, to a love neither had expected, but both had needed a love strong enough to illuminate even the darkest night.